Welcome to Goldfish on Games, where don't say I don't listen to you, as we're going to be looking at some of your suggestions in Game Engine Remakes Part 2. In the last video we checked out those that I tend to play quite a bit, where this time it's some of the suggestions that you left down in the comments. Now if you're not sure what an engine remake is, then please check out that previous video, as I do go into it in a little bit more detail. So let's just start it off, shall we? Cannon Fodder was briefly shown in the last video, so let's take a proper look at it now, as we check out Open Fodder, which will not only play Cannon Fodder, but also Cannon Fodder 2. But on top of that, it also supports all the various Amiga and PC demos that were released. And the data for those demos have actually been included with the Open Fodder install, so you can get playing those right away if you want, which includes the Cannon Soccer demo, which has you fighting against the Sensi Soccer teams. It's a bit weird, but quite fun, but also bloody hard. And there's also Cannon Fodder Plus, that included 4 different maps, as well as this mini quiz. But if you want to play the full game, then you will have to provide the data from the Amiga or the DOS version. The DOS version is easier to get your hands on, with it being up on GOG, and you just have to copy this single file, the cfeng.dat file, over to the folder and there you're done. The Amiga version though is a bit more work, as you'll have to extract all the various files out of the disk. Though you will already have those files if you happen to have a WHC load version of it. And I find it quite hard to pick a definitive version between them, as you get this extra detail on the PC version, which is nice, but the Amiga has obviously better audio, and surprisingly it actually has a larger viewing area, which is actually retained in this port. And with everything set up, you'll get this menu, that allows you to select which game or demo you want to play, which can be a little hard to read at times, as the randomised backgrounds might get in the way of some of the text. But it is quite cool, and they use the same tech to build random maps that you can play on as well. Playing the regular game will actually give you the intro sequence and the classic Boot Hill, and you'll go through all the missions as you'd expect. And if you've not played Cannon Fodder, then I suggest you check out the video that I've done for a little bit more detail. And if you've seen that video, then you'll see, for the most part, this is very faithful to the original game. The chopper cutscenes don't feel quite as smooth, but that's been a little bit nitpicky. I also think the mouse input might have been tweaked, as it always felt a bit oversensitive on the Amiga, so I think it actually feels a little bit better here. And if you happen to have both versions of the game installed, then you get this extra option, as you can toggle between the two editions by using the F1 and F2 keys. So you get to see the extra detail in the graphics, or slightly more viewing area. It is a really neat touch that they added this so you can do it at runtime, rather than just selecting it in a config file. But if you do want to edit the config file, you'll actually find some interesting options, like the ability to set the number of rows and columns for it to draw, which means you can have both versions of the game show the exact same amount, or boost it way up, which can look absolutely amazing on the larger levels, as you can see far more of what's going on, though it does trigger some of the enemies a bit early. But it doesn't look all that great on the smaller ones. And some of the cutscenes can also get a bit mixed up as well. And as you can imagine, this works really well with the randomised levels, as they tend to be much bigger. But if randomised levels aren't your thing, then thankfully they actually provide a level editor that you can download separately, that will allow you to make whole new levels, or even complete new campaigns. Outside of these changes, there are much in the way of quality of life improvements, as the game itself didn't really require it. It's obviously easier to play on modern systems, and you can play any version of the game as well as playing the first or the second one, so that is pretty neat. Rick Dangerous is another game that I've reviewed, and now you can easily play it with XRick, which can be downloaded or played in a browser as it includes all the data required, which is a little unique amongst all these engine remakes, as they typically try to stay legal by having you provide the data. This seems to be based off the first edition of the game, as it doesn't give you that menu that allowed you to select the level, but you can do that via the command line if you want to. And it seems most of the options seem to be command line switches as well. There's no config file or in-game menu, though there are a few F keys that you can use. And once you get into a level, well, it's the game you've come to love or hate, with it using the Atari graphics and sounds from what I can tell. Now, it doesn't feel or sound as smooth as I recall the Amiga version being, but that doesn't take anything away from this remake. Even though out of everything we're going to see today, this is probably the most bare-boned remake we're going to check out. As outside of a few cheats, there weren't really any changes made. And because the source code was released, it's been imported to a whole bunch of other platforms, including an Android edition, which actually included adverts and didn't have anything to do with the original dev, which does feel a little bit dirty trying to profit off an IP you don't own, or a source code that you didn't write. And because of that, when XRick 2 was made, which was done by another developer, they decided not to release the source code at all. But you can find a copy of the game from the XRick dev site, which is quite lucky as the original download and the XRick 2 site has been lost to time. This too includes all the data you need to play the game, but this time around they have included what looks like the Amiga dataset. And while the gameplay is identical, they have included a few extra visual flourishes, as there's now this particle effect when you zap a robot, or these little clouds when you blow something up. They felt so natural that I had to go back and check to make sure they weren't in the original release. There wasn't a readme in the zip that I downloaded, so I'm not sure if there's any other extras or command line options that you can trigger. And also, due to how it's been released, there's only a version for Windows as well, and I'm not sure if the source code will ever be released at this point, as there hasn't really been much updates since 2013. Though XRick itself recently moved to GitHub back in 2019 and got the browser version that I showed off earlier, so I guess it's possible that the project might come back from the dead at some point. Now let's jump to another early platformer with Commander Keen, and its engine remake, Commander Genius, which on first boot might give you this tiny little window that doesn't look all that great when resized, but if that does happen then just close it down and restart it and the text should be much clearer. Like most of the other games we've seen, this also requires the original game assets to play. Or you can play the original shareware releases, which this launcher gives you the ability to directly download, so you can actually get going quite quickly, at least if you want to check out the demos. But if you do have a copy of the original game, then you can copy over those files and play the whole thing. You might also want to change some of the defaults. I don't think linear scaling is a particularly good look, but if you select best or nearest, it does look quite nice. And for those of you who haven't played Commander Keen, well, it's an early platformer for the PC, and its big hook at the time was its smooth scrolling, which this obviously replicates quite nicely. And you get to explore these large maps, and then enter into the levels where you get to jump around and shoot your way to the exit, all the while trying to find keys to open up doors. Yes, this has some very early ID design in it. And the goal in the first game, well, is to try and find all the parts for your spaceship. Due to the age of the first game, it is just PC speaker for sound effects, and EGA or CGA for graphics, but it does look pretty good, and plays just how I remember it. The series did get quite a few entries over the years, so the later games took advantage of VGA graphics and AdLib for audio. Now I actually wish I knew about this the last time I played the Keen games, as I had some problems with them scrolling on my old DOS machine. It was quite jerky rather than the smoothness that it should have been, and I had to find some fan patches to fix it up, which obviously this doesn't need. But it does have some mods that you can check out, which actually includes an SVGA upgrade mod. Now this will update all the graphics so they'll look more detailed, all while trying to keep with the original styling and feel, but they also added Sound Blaster quality music and sound effects, which is really cool, but I have to say I think I'll stick with the original classic look and feel. And if you manage to complete all the Keen games, then there's a whole realm of fan mods, tweaks, remakes, and whole new games for you to check out, all of which can be gotten from that download menu. So overall this is a great little package that feels like the perfect way to experience some of the earliest work by ID Software. Next up is Dune 2, a game that's had a number of fan remakes over the years, and has a few currently active ones at the moment. The first one is the most faithful, Open Dune, which really should have been called Open Dune 2, as Dune was its own completely different game. But naming issues aside, this is actually quite good. You need to have the original files from the latest version of the DOS game, and you can use all 3 regions, so you can be Dune 2, the building of a dynasty if you're in the US, or Dune 2, the battle for Arrakis if you're playing the European version. Now there's one thing I have to say right off the bat, and that's about the music, as this seems to be just using the MIDI version and passing it onto the OS to play, which can result in some really bad sounding audio, and some areas where it just seems to be missing some of the music.
Control of Dune. The noble Atreides. The insidious Ordos.
If you happen to have it set up, you can actually use Munt, so you can get the MT32 music instead. But by default, you just get this. And getting into the game, we find a very familiar look, as this is Dune 2 warts and all. You have this highly zoomed in map, where you can select a unit by clicking on it, and then you have to decide on its action by selecting it off the sidebar or via the keyboard, and then you can click where the action is going to take place. You also have to do construction by entering a building, then finding what you want via a full screen menu. But it does mean you get to look at this great bits of artwork for each of the buildings and the units. Now that's not to say this engine remake doesn't have any changes at all. It actually has a list of enhancements that they have made over the original. But a lot of this seems to be bug fixes, or making changes where some of the code didn't seem to match up with what was stated in the manual or the UI.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
As you can't group select, you can use the follow trick instead. This is when you move a unit, then tell another unit to move towards it. This results in the second unit following the first, and thus they'll both move together across the map. It's a little fiddly to set up, but can be useful. Amazingly, one thing they did include was the copy protection, which requires you having to answer these questions, and of course, those answers are only in the manual, so you're going to have to look them up. And I swear I got the answers right here, but it just didn't seem to like them. One thing I did notice was the mouse getting stuck in the corner. I'm not entirely sure what caused it, but it only seemed to be an issue when I was running in full screen. With this being so close to the original, and having so little in the way of quality of life improvements, it shouldn't surprise you too much to find out there's a fork called Dune Dynasty, which sets out to give the game some modern touches. To run this, you have to use the EU version of the data files, and if you don't, the game will still actually run, but it might not be 100% right. Like you'll get missing unit sounds, for example. The enhancements this time are far more in depth, as you can now zoom in and out of the map, as well as do group select, as well as be able to move and attack without needing to touch the menu at the side. Though you can still do it if you want, or use the keyboard shortcuts as well. Construction has also been changed. No longer do you need to enter the building. There's now this CNC or Mega Drive Dune 2 version, if you like, sidebar. Now you still need to select the building first, but it is still a little bit quicker than having to go through the whole setup. Now from the config file we can actually tweak some more of the settings, like increasing or decreasing the scale of the UI, or using the high resolution overlays for the vehicles. Now personally I prefer a scaled up UI with those classic overlays. But then I did used to play this on both DOS and Amiga back in the day, so the older look looks a little better to me. But possibly the best improvement was the support for the ad-lib soundtrack, which sounds so much closer to how I remember it being.
The noble Atreides. The insidious Ordos. And the evil.
But if you want, you can actually provide music files for the other versions of the game, which also includes the quite excellent Dune 2000 soundtrack, which honestly was the best bit of Dune 2000. I also want to mention Dune Legacy, which is another engine remake but has gone much further down the modernising route. It's also a project that has been around for quite a long time. I think I made some artwork for this back in the early 2000s, back when it was pretty much the only Dune 2 remake around. Now it actually has quite the long list of changes, which includes being able to make groups, has 3 different zoom levels, and a completely overhauled UI. There's also far more options for the units, which we can see on the side. The hunt option is interesting, as I've seen units go off and find and attack some enemies that weren't even on the screen. The AI has also been changed, as there's now multiple different ones that you can select.
Construction complete.
And this goes along with the new single player maps and skirmish mode. There's even a level editor, and you know how I like a good level editor. And if you want to, you can even jump online to play this against mates. Now I will say the main font that's used is a little poor. Having no outline around it like the original means it does get lost in some of the screens. So overall, out of all the 3 that I've shown here, I'm pretty much leaning towards Dune Dynasty as my go-to.
Yes, sir. Infantry out. Reporting. Acknowledged.
I hope you enjoyed that batch of engine remakes as much as I did, because it's been a lot of fun covering them, so I'll have to do more videos. So if you've got more suggestions, please leave them down in the comments and I'll get around to it. So until next time, I've been the Goldfish, that has been some classically remade games, and this has been Goldfish on Games. Thank you for watching my video, I do hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, you can let me know down in the comments, or you can use those buttons just below, you know the ones I mean. Or if you're not sure yet, then you can check out 2 other videos that I've done that are on the screen right now. So thank you again, and I hope to see you soon.